We are here to talk about the art of leading change. My guest, Mike Bonem, has written two really important books that I hope that you will check out both of them. The first is called Leading from the Second Chair. Leading from the second chair is when you're in a role of leadership where you have great influence and great responsibility, but you are not the ultimate authority. Now, the reality is that all of us lead from the second chair at some time or at some point or another, right? If you're a pastor, you answer to a bishop. If you're a bishop, you answer to an archbishop or you answer to the pope, right? Everyone answers to someone. If you're not a pastor, if you're a director of faith formation, right? Or if you're a director of liturgy, you answer to your pastor. So his book, Leading from the Second Chair, is how can we maximize our leadership when we are not the primary top leader in the organization? Really great and important book because it applies to all of us. Today's book also applies to all of us, The Art of Leading Change. Now, many of you know me from my time with Parish Catalyst. I was with Parish Catalyst for 8 years, and we did much of what I'm doing now. We helped parishes innovate and learn and create new strategies and plans for making disciples. I will say the place that those things most often fell apart is in implementation, when leaders went back to their parishes and tried to bring about some of these changes. And I would say if there's anywhere that we failed as Parish Catalyst in equipping pastors and leaders, it is in this area of the art of leading change. We talked about it a little bit, but it is so vital because you can do all the great planning and dreaming you want to and come up with really great ideas, as I'll mention in the webinar. But if you are not good at implementing those things and executing them and getting other people on board and bringing them along in that vision, and allowing them to collaborate with you in that vision, you won't be able to see change succeed. I bet if I took a poll right now and said, how many of you would say yes and amen to that? You'd probably all raise your hands. You've all seen things fail at the stage of implementing them because people just didn't get on board and it didn't happen. So we're going to talk today about how you can make it most likely for these things to succeed and work and move forward. So, with no further ado, let's go to my conversation here with Mike Bonem on the art of leading change. And I look forward to hearing your questions and connecting with you at the end. Hello, Mike. Great to have you back again. Thanks for making some time for us.
Hey, John. Good to see you. Glad to do it.
Well, I enjoyed doing a webinar with you so much on your leading from the second chair, and I kind of hope we can do a part two of that someday. But when you mentioned you had this book, The Art of Leading Change, in the pastors that I've worked with and consulted, this is probably the biggest challenge that we face. I mean, everybody can brainstorm, everybody can come up with ideas. That's the fun part, right? But execution, implementation, that's where you really find out whether you're going to succeed or not. And this book, The Art of Leading Change, I love that it says art. Tell us about that title. What's the difference between the art and the science of leading change?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. And I think that is an important point. The very first book that I co-authored was called Leading Congregational Change. And back when I was doing conferences and all related to that book, I often said to the audience, I'm going to talk to you today about the science of leading change. There's an art side to it, and I'm not going to cover that today. And frankly, the science is a lot easier to talk about. It's like if you're familiar with John Cotter, his model for leading change, right? And there's 8 steps in that process. And so it's a stuff that you can distill down really easily into a PowerPoint presentation or a seminar or a book. So after 20 years of working with congregations, helping them to think about change, I thought, you know what, I've got to at least try to address this really messy topic around the art of leading change. So the art is all the stuff that falls in between the cracks with the science. So, Cotter may say, well, you need to build a coalition before you really launch into any kind of change. And that's absolutely true. But how big does the coalition need to be? How long do you need to wait to try to get people on board? If you've got a lot of people on board, but a couple of really key leaders who are not on board, is that good? Can you move forward or not? And those are all the little nuances that really make leading change so complicated. And so, even though I've often said it's really hard to distill the art of leading change into a book, I attempted to do it with this book.
Well, it's fantastic, and it's those. You're right. It's the details and it's the nuances of things and the soft skills that it takes to execute those things. I love that your subtitle of the book is 10 Perspectives on the Messiness of Ministry. Let's just get that out there. This is messy. It is not, everyone doesn't have to do what you tell them to do. You've got to navigate a lot of relationships and history and all of those things. But share with us those 10 perspectives, and then we'll circle back on a few of them.
Sure. And I tried to write each of these really in short phrases so that, if a leader or ministry team was studying this together, they might not remember all the details, but they might remember the phrase. And so the first one is lead with trust. Trust is foundational to any kind of change effort. The second one I call dig beneath the surface, and that's really talking about understanding culture and the culture that the culture is sort of like the bottom part of the iceberg, the parts you can't see, but it sure is big and can get in the way of any kind of change efforts. The third one is take the next step, or take the right next step. And it goes from it says, before we get too wrapped around the axle with big, bold, big strategic plan, which is important, vision's important, but what people really want to know is what's the right next step that we need to take. The next one is called heavy loads require strong teams. And that's just a recognition that any change initiative should be led by multiple people, not by a single person. And the bigger, the more complex the change initiative, the more of it, the more capability you need on the team that's leading it. One of my favorite ones is the next one. It's you can't please everyone. And that's just, I've seen a lot of churches that get stymied because they want to get 100% approval for a change initiative. And that rarely happens. And then related to that, really, the next one is called resistors are not the enemy, especially in today's society. We're being conditioned more and more to say, well, anybody that speaks, that thinks differently or speaks in opposition to me, they're bad. They're the enemy. And I should, basically cast it out of my path. But that's not necessarily true. And it's not the right way to lead change. The last four, momentum is your friend. We need to build momentum to support our change efforts. What they heard, not what you said, is all about communication and how often we fall short in communicating effectively around change. Who is not in the room? When we're talking particularly around change in a church, a lot of times changes that need to be made or for us to be more effective in the ministry we do out in the community or for people who are not yet a part of our church or our parish. And yet we need to make sure that we set up ways to listen to and hear from those people, but they're not at the room. They're not around the leadership table with us. And then the very last one is called look up before you look ahead. And that's real important acknowledgement that if we're not asking God to lead us and to guide us in the change process, the rest of it really doesn't matter. So those are the 10 perspectives on the messiness of ministry and the art of leading change.
Well, I would love to spend an hour on each of those, but we'll just first ask everybody to go buy the book, and there is an audio book. So if you're a leader like me, like many leaders, if you're a leader who's not a great reader and you don't feel like you don't have time for it, you are not alone. I know so many leaders that just admit I'm not a good reader. The audiobook, I encourage you to check it out. Listen to it in your car while you're walking. Great way to take those things in. But I want to revisit a few of these and have you unpack them a little bit more for us. The first one is lead with trust. Trust is something that I find to be incredibly important with teams. Simon Sinek said that A team is not a group of people that work together. A team is a group of people that trust each other. And tell us about the importance of trust in making any sort of change endeavor work.
Well, when we're leading, and particularly when we're leading change, there's going to be questions about what did you mean? What are your motives? And those questions sound really different if they're heard through ears that have learned to trust the leader versus if the person has not learned to trust the leader. And one of the mistakes that I see people make, ministry leaders make often, is they say, "Well, look, I'm a pastor, I'm a priest, I'm a ministry leader. Of course, you should trust me. I mean, I've taken this vow before God. I actually believe the Ten Commandments, and believe that you shouldn't lie." And while that's all true, there's you know trust in pastors, according to some of the most recent survey data, is at an all-time low. And trust is more than just like, will you bring back the correct amount of change if I give you money to go buy a latte at Starbucks for me? Trust is, when we're talking about leadership, is much more nuanced and complicated than that. Lencioni talks about different levels of trust, and that bring back change for from Starbucks is just the lowest level of trust. I think about when our kids were younger, there were lots of teenagers that I would have trusted to like run an errand or do something like that. There were very few that I would have trusted to actually babysit my kids, and there were only one or two that I would have trusted if we wanted to go away overnight to babysit my kids. And it's that higher level of trust for leaders that's so important. And we build it with relationships, we build it with integrity, we build it by doing what we say that we're going to do. Yeah. Anyway, I could go on and on about that. Let me stop there, John.
Yeah, I heard a quote recently that said, at the time of decision, most of the business of choice has been done. And I connect that to this because I would say at the time of implementing change, the work of building trust is done. You you need to be working on that constantly because you never know when you're going to need that in order to do something. So, what are some ways that pastors build trust with people in that deeper way that you're describing?
For sure, relationship, just spending time with people. And so, one of the questions that often comes up when there's a change in pastoral leadership is, well, do I take advantage of a honeymoon period and press ahead with a lot of changes or not? And what I find is that it's rarely wise to press ahead with a lot of changes because you haven't had time to build relationships. And so it's the hospital visits and the pastoral counseling and the one-on-one conversations over coffee that build those relationships that I think start to create a foundation of trust. And then I mentioned a minute ago, doing what you said you're going to do. One of the common eroders of trust in ministry is when a pastor has a hard time saying no to someone. And so it goes something like this, "Hey, pastor, I've got an idea for something that we should do." And the pastor, instead of saying, "I don't know that we can put that in the budget right now," or "I don't know that that fits in our calendar right now," says, "Oh, wow, that's a really good idea." And so the person with the idea thinks they've gotten approval. The pastor has no intention at all of approving it, and it ends up dying. And then the person who had the idea has now lost trust in their pastor because they thought the pastor had said yes when the pastor really didn't, or at least didn't mean to say yes. And so just little things like that can happen over and over again that can either build trust or erode trust.
I think that's such a great example because I think our intuition is that saying no is going to break trust with people. When saying yes and not following through breaks it much more. Clear is kind, saying no in a loving, reasonable way to people is actually in the end going to make your relationship stronger than saying yes and not following through. That's so great. I'd love to get into all these. I dig beneath the surface. I mean, that to me is culture eats strategy for breakfast, right?
Yep.
That
Yeah.
when we work with parishes, we talk about five realities. We talk about what was, what is, what could be, what should be, and what will be. And that what was, what's existed in your parish, what is the history and the culture plays a huge factor in the decisions and the things that you do moving forward. So we'll skip past that, but I want to hear about this heavy loads require strong teams.
Mhm.
Tell us about the importance of shared leadership and actually having a team that can execute, having a team that's going to support your vision and not work against you when you're trying to make these changes.
Yeah, and I want to quibble for just a little bit on one thing you just said. You said a team that supports your vision, and I'm going to suggest that it's better to have a team that's a good cross section that collectively owns the vision together. Um,
Mm-hmm.
if it feels too much like I'm just looking for a team to support my vision, what you're really doing is looking for yes people, yes men, and yes women. Um, and they tend not to then really be able to carry the weight of the vision forward. Um, Jim Collins talked about a less effective leadership model being a genius with 1,000 helpers. And he says that it's a lot better to have a shared leadership approach where there are other strong leaders around whoever the first chair leader is, who help to shape the vision, who push back, who challenge, but ultimately they end up on the same page and they say, this is how we're going to move forward. And so creating that strong team means you got to spend time with them. Again, relationship, like I talked about a minute ago, it means that you need to be thoughtful about who you put on that team. And I often will tell people, look, don't pick somebody that you know is just they've got a vendetta against you, um, or they're always impossible to work with. But do pick somebody who's challenges you, who may have a different perspective than you, who will push back at times, because ultimately, when you know the process of figuring out exactly what are we going to do gets better when you have those sorts of people on the team, and then they're the biggest champions when it comes time to move forward. I think the other thing that I see happen sometimes in church and parish ministry is uh, leaders will pick people who are just not really strong to put on a team. Uh, and again, that's that genius with 1,000 helpers kind of mindset that Collins talked about. It's like, well, I can tell them what to do. And you may be able to tell them what to do, and they may say, well, yeah, sure, I'll do it. But their ability to execute well falls by the wayside. And so you need a strong people, even though they may be intimidating at times. I once interviewed a pastor who had a couple of different uh, ultra successful, ultra wealthy business people in his church. And I asked what it was like to be the pastor in that context. And he said, initially, I was scared to just even interact with them. And then I realized, you know what? There's a lot that I can learn from them. And I made a point to go to them in their workplaces and build that relationship and start to learn about leadership from them.
Well, I think that what you were just talking about ties into another question I got for you. I work with different types of leaders. There's leaders that surround themselves with people they can control, kind of like what you mentioned. And I hope to not work with those leaders. There's leaders that surround themselves with great people and they like release them to do great things. And there really is a working together. But there are times in leadership when a leader needs to make the call, knowing it's not going to be a popular
Mm-hmm.
decision, right? Like Henry Ford said, if I asked my customers what they really needed, they would have said faster horses, right? There's that time where you've got to go,
Mm-hmm.
I know everybody thinks this is what they need, but as the leader, I'm feeling strongly this is where we need to go. And it ties into that you can't please everyone. But what about when you know this is what you need to do, it's a change you need to make, and you know it's not you're not going to build a consensus. You know that this is just what you need to do. Can you give us a few pointers for those kinds of decisions?
Yeah, and that's the whole point of that perspective and chapter in the book is to not let a few people that are opposed to a change end up holding the whole church or parish hostage just because they can't get on board. Um, I do think that we often can get to a consensus. Consensus does not mean unanimity, but consensus does mean there's that great passage in the book of Acts, Council of Jerusalem, Acts chapter 15, where the leaders of the church at that time are trying to decide how much are they going to expect the new Gentile converts to follow all the Jewish customs. And they end up saying, you know what, we're not going to make them follow all these practices that we've had within the Jewish faith. And there's a phrase in the description. So the letter is written to go out to the Gentiles, and they say, it seemed right to the Holy Spirit and to us from the leaders of the church. It doesn't say we all agreed unanimously. But it seemed right to the Holy Spirit and to us. And so my advice to leaders often around that is, when do you get to the point through your own prayer and through your consulting with other key leaders in the church where you can say, it seems right to the Holy Spirit and to us. And we're going to move forward at that point, even though that may leave some people mad or some people upset. I do think that it's worth slowing down enough to try to get particularly your key leaders on board. And so sometimes it takes a little bit of extra time just to help them to process or to think about it or pray about a particular change. I worked with a church several years ago that was looking at a really major change. They were looking at relocating, and we had a pretty large group that was working on the process, and it seemed like we were almost to the point of saying yes. And one person who was really well connected with the senior adult population said, I'm not ready to move forward on this yet. And as we talked a little bit more, he said, I just feel like it's a bit rushed. Can we wait one more meeting before we make this decision? And we did, and he got on board with it. And so that's a case where I think it made a lot of sense to wait. Again, they didn't have unanimous support for it, but it was worth waiting. So yeah, you can't please everyone. You don't want to let a few naysayers hijack a process, but it's good to try to work on the relationship and listen to the objections enough to see if you can get a good number of people on board.
Yeah, and I want to stick with that one just for a little bit, because it's probably one that I've seen be the biggest hindrance to pastors moving forward on things. Is in an effort to try to please everyone, they don't please anyone, or they just keep everything copacetic and they never really move forward in good things. Kind of a maintenance mindset, really, at the fear of conflict. So tell me more about the cost of trying to please everyone.
Well, there's a really significant cost, John. First is that the first thing is that maintenance is a myth. Maintenance is a myth. You don't maintain. If you think you're maintaining, you're actually almost certainly gradually declining. And so that's the first cost, is when we think we're just going to hold steady and maintain, we're actually, Robert Quinn says we're making a choice to go down a path of slow death. He said our only choice is to make either deep change or slow death. And so that's the first thing I would say. The other thing that I think is equally important, and you touched on it, but the people who will be most excited about a new initiative or about making changes, Everett Rogers talked about the diffusion of innovations. They're the ones on the very front end of the bell curve. They're the innovators. They're the early adopters, is another part of his language. But they're the people that are really gung-ho. And if you drag it out too long, you'll actually lose them. They may end up leaving the church completely, or they may just kind of check out of leadership and say, look, I'll still be here, but don't ask me to lead anymore. And that's a huge cost when you lose people like that. And so we need to be really aware that, dragging our feet too long because we're afraid it's going to upset a few people is actually going to upset a different group of people.
You are so right. And I've seen that firsthand. Maybe we'll do another one of these on staffing, but I've seen a pastor lose 4 great staff in an attempt to please one toxic staff person that they were unwilling to deal with. And the great people left because they don't want to hang around for that kind of stuff. They've got better things to do, right? It's so, so
Right.
true.
Yeah.
And I'm glad you mentioned the diffusion of innovation curve because that speaks to our next group, which is resistors are not the enemy. And I will say that early in my consulting work, I saw resistors as the enemy. I want
Mm,
to, I love change. I love
mm,
innovation. And I look at that curve and I think, my innovators, my early adopters are the same percentage as the laggards, those awful laggards, right? That just don't want they're bah humbug curmudgeons. They don't want anything to change. And I began to grow in empathy for the laggards as I began to see that, we're asking them to let go of things that are meaningful to them.
right.
That change is grief and it's a loss of something important. So help us understand more why resistors are not the enemy and how we can help them journey better with us.
Well, again, I'll go back to what I said a minute ago that we're being conditioned more and more in society to think that anybody that, to stay in our echo chambers with people that think and talk just like us, and anybody who's not in that group is against us and is an enemy. So the first thing I would say is just try to recognize how much we're being influenced in that respect, and start to think differently. A second thing, in a ministry context, is we need to recognize that every single person we're working with is a child of God. They're made in God's image, and we're called to love them. And so that's a really critical starting point. But then I think from a practical perspective, often the people that seem to be resisting are not they're not doing it to be mean spirited. I mean, I rarely find it happens occasionally, but it's fairly rare that somebody starts off and just says, I hate pastors. And so I'm just going to be against my pastor, my priest, the leader of this, in this situation, no matter what. So there may be some relational damage that's been done that we need to repair. There may be relational damage that was done with a previous leader that we need to be aware of and we need to try to repair. But like you said a minute ago, there may also just be some grieving that they need to do because they're losing something important to them, or there may be some more questions they need to have answered. I worked once with a church down in I'm in Houston, and so NASA has a huge complex just south of Houston. I worked with a church down there. It was filled with NASA engineers, and they were not resistant to change in the sense, well, they were not opposed to change, but because they spent 40 or 50 hours a week in an environment that said failure is not an option. We have to make sure that we dot every I, cross every T, think of every possible thing that could go wrong. Then their questions sounded like resistance because they wanted to know exactly how is this going to work? What are all the contingency plans? And so, in that situation, you listen to their concerns and you realize I'm going to have to adjust some of how I lead change to deal with that. I tell the story in the book of a church that is considering canceling its Saturday night worship service. And one of the people who's resistant to that is a person whose spouse is a realtor and who does open houses most Sunday mornings. And so what may seem like just digging your heels in, I think this is a bad idea, turns out it has a really good reason behind it. And so, so the pointers I think around this are really get to know the people, get to know the stories, get to know where the resistance is coming from, because a lot of times with a little bit of care and love and listening, and sometimes explaining, they'll come around.
I've seen that happen. And then there's also a degree that we just have to know that when we've done all that we can do, it's at some point it's up to them. And I've found those people they usually don't leave over these situations. Our fear of worst case scenario is usually not true. They're frustrated and disappointed for a while, but I think we also don't fear enough the people that we're going to lose if we don't make the change, right?
Right. And that's why those two perspectives have to go together, right? That, you can't please everyone. You can't let them hijack, but you also need to not treat the ones that are resistors as enemies and as bad people.
So true, so true. Hey, these 10 perspectives, you kind of have them bookended by a couple of principles. Would you share those with us?
Well, the on the front end, it's just the recognition of how difficult change is, and change is especially difficult in churches. So, I mean, you think about any corporation that's trying to make a large change, they're going to have struggles, they're going to have challenges with it. People are going to be resistant. But in the church, it becomes even more difficult. It's more difficult because we're volunteer dependent. And so in a corporate environment, you have the power of the paycheck. In a church environment, they're volunteers. You can't say, well, if you don't want to get on board with this change, we can no longer employ you. And so the volunteers may just kind of quietly quit. Or even worse, sometimes they stay right in place, but they don't do what we're asking them to do. It's more complicated in church because we have so many traditions, and we tend to baptize our traditions as being things that are ordained by God and therefore can never be changed. And I like traditions, but sometimes traditions get in the way of doing what God might want us to do. It's more difficult in a church because sometimes we're very unclear even about how decisions are supposed to be made about our governance models. And so that can make it more confusing. So yeah, the front book end is just recognizing that change is difficult and that it's messy, and it's particularly messy in a church. And so if someone's listening to this and they're a business person who is trying to help lead change in the church, just realize it's a lot messier in the church environment than in the business environment. Or, if you're a clergy person who is frustrated at the advice you're getting from your business people, help to explain to them that it is, yes, that some of those ideas and principles are valid, but it's messier in a church. So that's the front book end. And then the back book end, I just called the courage to change, because at the end of the day, there's a lot that's not said in my book on the art of leading change. But even if I had all the wisdom of the world and said everything that could be said about how to lead change well, the person or the people who are going to be leading change still have to have courage. There's going to be resistance. There's going to be setbacks. There's going to be times when things don't go well. You have, part of the courage. I break down some different aspects of courage. One of them is the courage to fail. We cannot, despite my NASA engineers that I worked with in that one church, we cannot foolproof a new initiative that's going to involve a lot of change. We're going to do our best to work it out, but it may fail. We're going to do our best to get people on board, but somebody's still going to be critical. And so we have to have courage in the face of all of that to lead the change that we feel like God is calling us to lead.
Remind me of something that Larry Osborne once shared. He said, we've never changed anything here. We've tried a lot of experiments, and the ones that worked, we kept doing.
Yeah.
And just that when you're introducing change, a lot of changes you can introduce as, hey, we're going to try something different here for a little bit. And if it works, we'll keep doing it. We may change it, adjust it, adapt it. And I think people are a lot more open to something that is an experiment than, hey, here's a big change and we're never going back, right?
Yeah, I'm a huge believer in that language around experiments. And really the perspective in the book on momentum is your friend talks just about that point, that, you can, some things it's harder to experiment with. But I would say 80 or 90% of the changes that we might think about making in a church, we can tiptoe into it with some sort of experiment. If you spend a minute, and I encourage pastors to do this with their leadership teams. Spend a minute just thinking about, what does experiment mean? Take it to a scientific context. A scientist who's doing an experiment has a hypothesis, but they don't know if it's going to work. And so when it doesn't turn out the way they expected, they don't talk about it as being a failure. They talk about, what can we learn from this? How can we make changes to make it even better, or to produce the results that we want? pharmaceuticals would be a great example, right? There's all sorts of experiments that people run to try to create a drug that will work well and that will not have bad side effects. And, for every drug that comes to market, there are dozens, probably more like hundreds or thousands of experiments that they attempted that didn't work, or at least didn't work well enough to bring it to market. And I would hope in our churches we don't have to run thousands of experiments to get one thing that works. But that language of experimentation gives us a lot more permission to try things and for them to not turn out the way we expected, and then to learn from them.
I'm glad you brought that up because that's something we talk about a lot with Great Catholic Parishes about the any innovative organization, any organization that adapts well to changing culture and times recognizes that failure is has to be an option. It's how we figure out what works and what doesn't work. I love that Winston Churchill quote where he says, "Success is not final and failure is not fatal. It's the courage to continue that counts." And I think that pulls that all together. Um, I know there are people listening to this that tuned in because they are dealing with change right now, real life. They're looking for some help with this. Maybe there's a change they know they need to make. It may be a data management system that's going to disappoint half the staff or annoy half the staff. Maybe they need to change a mass time and they know that the old guard are going to be upset about it. And they're just looking to gain that courage to step into it, besides reading your book, which I would really encourage them to do, could you just give them a word of encouragement as a coach, as a consultant, that you would just hope that might help them take that next step?
A couple of things, I guess, come to mind, John. One of the one of the things that can get in the way of leading change is we just get so busy just in the day-to-day stuff, and so it's really easy to say, well, I'll work on that more complex initiative tomorrow, and then tomorrow becomes tomorrow, right? And it just drags out. Um, and I spent 11 years on staff of a church. I understand how busy things get, but we do need to be real intentional to carve out some time, both for reflection, balcony time, as Heifetz calls it, right? To think about what are the big changes that we need to make and how do we need to go about making them, and to be able to implement those things. So, how do you manage your basically your calendar, right? Your time allocation, so that you have the space to lead the change that needs to be made. I think, to go back to something we said earlier, recognize that you're not going to be able to make everyone happy. And so just kind of getting over that idea that I'm going to get everybody on, that I'm going to get 100% approval for a change, can help someone to move forward. And then I would say also borrow some courage. And what I mean by that is, that's where that perspective of heavy loads requires strong teams. Get some other people around you who can either help to lead it or who can at least be a positive influence in helping you to think about this. Yeah, we really do need to move forward on this. Yes, there are going to be some people that are upset, but this is the right thing to do. I think all of those help a lot. And then, the very last perspective that I touched on when we ran through them all, of looking up before you look ahead. There's a big difference in my willingness to move forward with a difficult change initiative if I fundamentally just have a deep conviction this is what God wants us to do, versus, oh, this just feels like something I would like to do. And so, again, part of that, managing the calendar and managing my time, is having enough time to be really prayerful about what we're going to do, because once I have that conviction that this is where God is leading us, I have no excuse to hold back.
That's great, and that's the best place for us to end. I love that. Well, Mike, thank you so much for sharing some of your time with us again. I really encourage all the leaders out there to check out your book, because it is something every leader must constantly face or not face, and it will directly impact the success of your leadership. So thank you again, and I hope to catch you soon.
Thanks, John. I've enjoyed the conversation.
Great stuff there. Mike is full of so much wisdom and experience, and really grateful for the work that he's done there. While you're putting in your questions, I want to share with you 5 things that stood out to me that I've seen time and again be so true. Well, some of these are things we're circling back on, a couple of them are new. One is that idea to experiment, 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 experiment. Any chance you get, you're thinking about starting an alpha, well, start it in a small group instead of rolling it out to the whole big parish. Find some people that are interested, do it in a small group. You'll learn from that. You'll also gain some stories and testimonies from that that you can use when you roll it out in a bigger way. You introduce it to more people. You'll have people that can share their experience from it. Also, surveying is in there with experimenting, getting having a more synodal process in change where people have a sense of buy-in and having a voice. I would also say sometimes when you change, you are going to lose people, and that's okay. I think about when you change in a way that causes something to be a larger investment from people. So let's say we change a sacramental prep like marriage or baptism or family faith formation, and we do it in a way that causes the people that are involved to invest more time, to come to more meetings, to be involved in a small group setting. You are going to lose people, but the people that you're losing are typically the people that are there to check the box, do the thing, get the certificate, and they're never coming back anyways. And those aren't the people that we're building our parish with. Those aren't the people who are stepping into this realm of growing as disciples. Whenever you ask for a larger investment, you will see less people and you will see some drop off. But the people that participate are people who are interested in growing. They're people that are interested in being a part. They will share with their friends what a great experience it has been if you provide a great experience, and it will grow again with a different type of person. I have heard multiple stories, especially in the area of family faith formation, or my friend Stephen is doing one on a marriage enrichment, that when they first started asking for this greater investment of people, there was a drop off, a significant drop off in participation. As a year went by and people participated in this more rich, community based experience, they began to tell their friends. And a year later, they had a waiting list for the same program that they had seen a significant decline in, because now it was people who shared the same desire to be more engaged in growing, and they were hearing about it and they wanted to be involved. So remember that if you lose people when you make a change, it doesn't always mean that you've made the wrong decision. It might mean you've made the right decision and you're losing the right people. Um, a couple of weaknesses I've seen in leaders in this area of change. One we mentioned, and that is a fear of disappointing people. A fear of disappointing people will paralyze you in this area of change. I love this quote: you cannot change what you're unwilling to confront. So if you're unwilling to change things because of people, you will never change that area. You'll never see any improvement. You'll never see any growth in it. The other side of that is people who don't care what anyone else thinks, and they just make unilateral decisions that doesn't involve any buy-in and doesn't care how it's affecting other people. That person is equal or even more dangerous and more damaging. Um, Resistors are not the enemy. That's the takeaway from that. And I would encourage you also to lean into those resistors. Reach out to them, learn from them, ask questions. I love the phrase "tell me more" when they're disappointed or frustrated with the change. Find out why it's affecting them the way that it is. It doesn't mean that you're going to adapt everything to them, but it means they get to share. You get a deeper insight into what their challenge is, and maybe you might adapt it, but you also might help them understand that the change is not affecting them the way that they think it will. A lot of times people have perceptions about change that it's going to mean this, this, and this, and that's not the reality at all. So I would say the last thing I'll say is to emphasize to them what is not going to change. We're not changing the mission of our parish. We're not changing our desire to walk with you in your journey with Christ. We're not changing what we do. or why we do it, but maybe we're changing how we do it in an effort to serve people better. So emphasize what is not going to change. And I think a lot of times that will help comfort people as well. I want to address a question here. It's really important. And I know it's more than one person that has it. And that is, how can change happen if the pastor is not willing? That's an important question. Uh, I get no money from Mike's books, but I would encourage you to check out his book, Leading from the Second Chair, because it deals significantly on how to help change happen when your leader is not necessarily willing. There's incremental change. There's maybe you don't get all the change that you want, but there's smaller ways that you can implement change. There's also how you can bring change to your area and your space that you lead that's not in contradiction to the pastor, but it's just not rolling it out to the whole parish in the way that you might like to see it happen. We can always love and serve and work with and bring change to the people around us. Maybe not on the level that we'd like to, but I encourage you to check out Mike's book. And I will just also frankly say to that, how can change happen if the pastor is not willing? You may be working in a place, which unfortunately or difficultly might also be your home parish, that you recognize that I cannot serve here in a way that I feel fulfilled because the leader above me has such a smaller vision compared to my vision that I will never be satisfied here. And that may be something you may have to accept and recognize. And I just would say, if that's the case, you need to consider maybe finding a leader that has a common vision to you and serving them. I think too often people stay in a place serving where they're unhappy, they're disgruntled, they feel very oppressed by the leader and their ability to be who they feel called to be, but they never make any actions towards that, towards changing that. And maybe that's where you need to change. Maybe you need to be the one implementing change in your own life in a way that you find a place that you feel fulfilled serving. So please feel free to reach out to me with any other questions you have. It's just john@greatcatholicparishes.org. Thank you for joining once again, and I hope to see you at some of the webinars in the future. The future webinars are listed on our website, greatcatholicparishes.org. Thanks again. God bless.